Here's the dirty secret of LSAT coaching that nobody in this industry talks about. Most instructors have a mental model that sorts students into two categories: responders and non-responders. Responders do the work and their scores climb. Non-responders seem to work just as hard, but their scores stay flat. And if you're an LSAT coach with that model, it's incredibly convenient. Every time a student doesn't improve, you've got a ready-made explanation that has nothing to do with you. They're just a non-responder. They've hit their ceiling, their reasoning ability just is not there. And I've seen students using that explanation for years. It feels compassionate, it feels realistic, and even feels kind. But what it actually does is it lets the coaches off the hook. Every student the coach can't help becomes evidence that some students just can't be helped. And that's circular logic. Now, let me tell you what that comfort actually cost people. The LSAT is the single most consequential standardized test in American higher education. The difference between a 160 and a 170 isn't 10 points, it's the difference between full tuition and a full ride. And at a lot of schools, of course, it's the difference between getting in and not getting in. And over the course of your career, that scholarship gap can be worth $150,000 or more. And so, if a coach looks at a student and quietly decides they've hit their ceiling, the cost of that is not abstract. It's a student settling for a score that they didn't have to settle for, taking on debt they didn't have to take on, going to a school ranked below where they could have gone, all because their coach decided, based on a comfortable story about talent, that this was as good as it gets. Now, I need you to understand how we can finally break that belief. I was going through actual behavioral data from a group of students, looking at the questions they completed per day, the days they studied per week, whether they reviewed their missed questions, and how deeply they reviewed. And I was looking to confirm what I already believed, that some students do the work and improve, and other students do the work and don't improve. That was the framework. I just wanted to see it in the numbers. And so I started looking students who improved on one side, students who plateaued on the other. Then I cross-referenced it against the behavioral data, and the pattern wasn't what I expected. The students who improved weren't the ones with higher diagnostic scores or with stronger academic backgrounds. They were just the ones who had done more questions, studied more consistently, and reviewed their mistakes differently. And that part was interesting, but the part that really broke my framework was the non-responders. I started checking their actual behavior against what they had told me. One student told me he studied almost every day. Fact check, he studied 14 out of 30 days. One student told me she was doing tons of practice questions. Turns out she had completed about 400 questions over the course of 3 months, roughly 3 questions per day. One student told me he always reviews his wrong answers. So I asked him to walk me through his last missed question, and he said, I looked at the right answer and it just made sense. That was his entire review process. Of course, that's not real review. And it kept going one after another. Every single non-responder was either doing dramatically less volume than they believed, studying far less consistently than they reported, or reviewing at a depth that wasn't actually review. Every single one. So I sat there staring at this spreadsheet, and I discovered that the non-responder category wasn't real. It was a ghost created by the gap between what my students told me they were doing and what they were actually doing. And I believed them because it confirmed what I already wanted to believe. So effective prep is actually annoyingly simple. Do a couple thousand questions over the course of your studying, study almost every single day, review the questions you miss with real depth. And I'll get to what that means in a minute. And you take the LSAT more than once to help you maximize your score. That is the formula. Students who actually do that score in the mid-160s at a minimum, and most of them score in the 170s. Now, you're probably thinking, if it's that simple, why doesn't everyone do it? Because almost nobody actually does it. The consistency bar alone eliminates almost everybody. If you study every single day, you are in the top 5% of LSAT students. And I don't mean that to be motivational here. It's actually a fact. People are wildly less consistent than they think they are because they're busy, because LSAT studying's hard, because they don't have time in the day. But it's hard to carve out the time. If you can, you are the exception rather than the rule. If you treat LSAT prep like training, like you are a college athlete, you don't study when you feel like it. You study on a schedule every morning, 90 minutes, 6 days a week. You do 25 questions a day, plus 30 minutes reviewing every one you missed. If you do that, you don't have to be smarter than other people, or a better reader, or have a gift for logic. You just got to be consistent in a way that almost nobody else is. And the painful thing is that during the same period, there could be another student who's studying maybe half the time, doing a third of the questions. But you might genuinely believe you're working just as hard because it's hard for you to carve out the time. Now, why does doing thousands of questions actually work? It's because while the LSAT looks like a reasoning test, it's actually a test of pattern recognition. I mean, think about chess grandmasters. They're not calculating every possible move from scratch. What separates them is not raw brain power, it's that they've got a library in their brains of thousands of different chessboard positions stored in their memories. If they see a particular arrangement of pieces, they recognize it. They're not thinking their way to the answer, they already just see the answer from their previous experience, and the LSAT works the same way. There are only so many ways to structure a logical reasoning question. There are only so many different types of flaws, only so many tricks in the answer choices. And when you've done thousands of questions, you've seen the vast majority of those patterns. You're going to start recognizing the shape of a question before you finish reading it because you've been there before. But there's a catch to this, of course. Volume alone is not enough. Volume plus review is the magic key. Most students, when they miss a question, they'll look at the right answer, they'll read the explanation, they'll think to themselves, oh yeah, that makes sense, and they move on. But that's not review. That's just checking the answer key, and you've learned nothing if you do that. You will miss the same type of question next time around. Real review doesn't start with the right answer. You start with yourself. You go back to the stimulus and you ask, what did I think this argument was saying? Where exactly did my understanding break down? Because almost every single wrong answer on the LSAT starts with a misread. You missed a word, you skimmed past a scope shift, you read correlational evidence and treated it like a causal claim. The mistake happened in your reading of the passage, not in your evaluation of the answer choices. And then you got to ask the harder question. You ask yourself, do I keep doing this? Is this a pattern? And almost always the answer is yes, because mistakes on the LSAT are not random. They come in clusters. The same student who misreads one causal argument will misread the next 5 of the same type. If you miss one scope shift, you're probably going to miss them all day. And those patterns are invisible to you until something forces you to look. And that's where LSAT coaching comes in. I was looking over a student's set of questions, the ones they'd missed, and I noticed that the student made the same 3 mistakes in a row, kept missing scope shifts. The stimulus would make a claim about experienced teachers, and the conclusion would generalize to all teachers, and the student just wasn't catching it. And when I pointed it out, she looked at me and she said, I know what a scope shift is. I've read about it, but I don't see it when I'm doing questions. And that sentence is the entire LSAT in miniature. If you know what a scope shift is theoretically, but you can't see it in real time under pressure, it's understandable because they're completely different skills. One is knowledge, the second is pattern recognition, and you only build pattern recognition through the cycle of attempting, failing, getting feedback, and looking for it again with a different example. But if you were to do 100 logical reasoning questions and every single time you finish one, before you look at the answers, you write down what the conclusion claims and whether it goes beyond what the evidence supports. And once you do that, you can't unsee them. Your score could go up 4 points in 1 week because you will finally encode a pattern you'd been skimming past for months. And I can hear the pushback, and it's fair, so I want to address it. Steve, you're saying anybody can score 170 plus. What about those with learning disabilities? What about people who work full-time who can't study 6 days a week? What about severe test anxiety? Do you really think there are 0 natural differences? No, I don't, of course. There are people for whom this test is genuinely harder. There are people who need accommodations and should get them. There are people whose circumstances make studying every single day a real sacrifice, not just a question of discipline. And I'm not dismissing that. But here's what I am saying. The group of people who believe they've hit their ceiling is enormous, and the people who actually have is tiny. It's not even close. Most people who think they've maxed out have not maxed out. They've hit the limit of what their inconsistent effort and shallow review can produce. And I know that feels like a ceiling because you're working hard in the way you understand hard work to mean. But the bottleneck is your method. And that distinction matters because thinking you've hit your ceiling means you stop. However, if you've just hit the limit of your current approach, then just change your approach. Don't treat review as a chore you do after the real work. Review is the real work. Every single question you miss is an opportunity to learn something new. You're not asking here what is the right answer. You're asking where exactly did my reading of this stimulus break down? And have I made this mistake before? You want to build a running list of your own recurring errors. Scope shifts, causal reasoning gaps, confusing sufficient for necessary conditions. Maybe you're going to have 6 or 10 different categories like this. And you'll find that almost all of your mistakes fall into one of those buckets. If you go from doing a couple hundred questions to a couple thousand questions and start studying nearly every single day, you're going to see yourself improving in a specific, measurable way because consistency gets a lot easier when you see that your work is actually working. And that's where you get 10, 15, 20 point increases. You got to change the variables to change the equation. And so if you're looking for help and support and guidance in going on this journey, I'm happy to help you out. I'm offering free LSAT tutoring for everybody watching this now or later, literally a free LSAT tutoring lesson with me personally. The link to book that free tutoring with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below the video on YouTube, in the comments on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and Instagram. That is an open offer for everybody watching this now or later. And for those of you just joining, I do these lives every single weekday, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific, here on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, wherever you're watching this. If you find this helpful, please spread the word. The only way this grows is through word of mouth. I don't do any advertising for these lives, and the algorithm doesn't really boost them because they can't run ads during a live, and the LSAT's more of a niche topic. But I do appreciate your support, getting the word out, sharing it to your socials, Discord, subreddits, Facebook groups, and so on. I see Rand is saying, you helped me get a 170 on the LSAT and I got a full ride to MSU. Congrats, Rand. That's awesome. I love hearing those success stories. Hope you're rocking it in law school if you started, or good luck in the fall. I see Nathan's asking, how are federal loans going to affect students wanting to go to law school in the future? So for those who aren't aware, the federal government has eliminated Grad Plus loans starting this summer. And so there's going to be a cap on how much you can borrow for law school. And so you'll have to resort to either private loans or dig into savings, or ideally get more scholarship money for law school. And the way you get more scholarship money for law school is by getting a higher LSAT score to incentivize schools to give you more scholarship money to help them raise their standing in the US News rankings. So ultimately, the answer is generally the same. No matter what your situation, getting better numbers, a stronger application can only improve your offers. And so if you're feeling stuck, like you've hit a plateau or a wall in your prep and you're looking for guidance, feel free to reach out and book the free tutoring with me. The link's in my bio. Kostas is asking, how limited are my options? Got a 173 LSAT, 386 GPA, BA in English and Philosophy, was a teacher for 3 years. I mean, your options are not that limited. Your numbers are quite good. 173 LSAT's pretty solid. 386 GPA is also pretty good as well. I mean, you've got a decent shot at some of the T14. You could go to a top law school or go to a lower ranked school with more scholarship money. And if you're applying to law school in the fall, you have the benefit additionally of applying the second application's open. So you're in a pretty good position there. Joel's asking, I'm a high school senior. Should I go to Berkeley or UCLA for poli-sci if I want to do law? And the truth is that it doesn't really matter where you go to undergrad for law school. It doesn't really matter what you major in either. I mean, UC Berkeley and UCLA are both state schools, right? So if you can get in-state tuition, you can save some money on undergrad and minimize your debt. But they're both solid undergrads, of course, and they wouldn't be limiting your options even if you didn't want to go to law school. But since you're pretty early, of course, I'd say enjoy undergrad, maintain a high GPA. LSAT and law school aren't going anywhere. You can come back in a couple of years. Yeah, Kostas, of course. Yeah, feel free to reach out. Happy to help you out. I see Ryan's asking, I've taken a few LSATs, got a few low scores, but if I hit a solid 160 to 170-ish, do the lower scores matter? No, not really. The good news is that law schools do not average multiple LSAT scores. They only take the highest score on your record. And so the higher score that you hit is ultimately what matters. Keep in mind, of course, that a 160 to 170 is a pretty large range of 10 points. You'll have much better outcomes with a 170 than with a 160, of course. But a higher score will offset a lower score, and the higher score is ultimately what matters. I see FHDs asking, do admissions officers take grade deflation into account like in UC Berkeley? So are you saying that while some schools have grade inflation, others have grade deflation like Berkeley, and as a result, will they take that into account when evaluating a lower GPA? Maybe. The thing is that ultimately the numbers are the numbers. They have no incentive to care about the undergrad institution because US News doesn't, the American Bar Association doesn't, just like they don't have reason to care what you majored in. Obviously, easier to get a high GPA in English than a high GPA in STEM, but the numbers are the numbers. That's what goes to US News for the rankings, and so you want the highest numbers possible. And if your GPA is lower than you would have liked, and you're going to be a so-called splitter applicant, then you just want to have a higher LSAT score to compensate. Not saying it's fair, of course, but that's what it is. And so if your GPA is pretty set, all the more reason to shoot for a higher LSAT. I see Pancakes saying 170 LSAT, GPA 347, 3 years in corporate banking experience. Okay, so the GPA is on the lower side, but you've got a pretty good LSAT. The work experience is nice as well. And the longer you've been out of undergrad, the less your undergrad GPA is going to matter, the more your LSAT score will matter. And of course, you can highlight your work experience in your resume and your application essays and so on. AD40 is asking, after learning the question types and doing practice questions, do you recommend doing timed or untimed drills? I would typically recommend transitioning into timed work because test day is not a drill. It's not enough to get the questions right. You got to get them right under test day conditions, considering pacing and time management and endurance. And one of the reasons that students' scores drop from the practice to the actual is because they have not properly simulated test day conditions. And so once you've established a good foundation and familiarity, time to move on to the practice tests in Law Hub. You could do some individual sections to work on your pacing and your time management, and then move on to full-length exams to build up your endurance. And that's one thing we do for our students in our LSAT Unplugged program is we help you craft a personalized study plan to make sure that you're getting into timed work before the big day. And if you want to talk through what your study plan could look like, of course, you can book the free LSAT tutoring lesson with me through the link in my bio. I see Icy's asking, how long should you study for the LSAT? As long as it takes. Ideally, you can knock out the LSAT in 2 to 3 months. That's the minimum I would recommend. If you can allow more time, like 5 or 6 months, that'll give you more of a runway to achieve your fullest potential. But of course, we got to consider your current starting point, your goal score, and your time frame, and how many hours you can put in per day and per week. All of that's important context. Now, I thought it might be a useful exercise to do some LSAT passage walkthroughs. If you all have access to the LSAT practice tests on Law Hub, you can follow along. I'm just going to do an analysis or a breakdown of a couple of reading comp passages. And I can't display the questions on screen due to copyright constraints. Unfortunately, we don't want to get sued or shut down, so I can't do that, unfortunately. But I think this might be helpful just to give you some more concrete examples of what it looks like to break down a reading comp passage structurally, focusing on the skeleton or the structure of the passage rather than getting bogged down in the details. Because the truth is that the content never really matters. It's a lot more about the way in which the author goes about making their argument. This is Prep Test 156, Section 3, Passage 1. This is a law passage about the tension between two things we want from the legal system: formal rules applied universally versus outcomes that actually feel fair. It's 3 paragraphs, it's pretty clean, and it's almost too clean. And that's what makes it dangerous. The difficulty here is medium to low on the structure, but students consistently give away points on this one because they misread the author's posture in the first 2 paragraphs. This passage punishes skimming in paragraph 3. The first 2 paragraphs set up what looks like a perfectly balanced on the one hand, on the other hand structure. And if you ride that symmetry into paragraph 3, expecting the author to stay above the fray, you're going to miss that the author picks a side and they pick it decisively. Every question about the author's attitude, the main point, and the passage's primary purpose runs through that moment. If you miss it, you're playing defense for the rest of the questions. Now, this is a law passage and it's doing one thing only. It's arguing. The main point here is that formalism in law should be abandoned because it cannot produce substantive justice under conditions of social inequality. The first paragraph lays out the first of 2 competing demands we place on the legal system. We want law that is rational, rule-based, universal, and blind to individual circumstances. The author here is presenting this demand with respect. It sounds reasonable, maybe even appealing, but you want to watch out for what's happening at the sentence level. The author is reporting this demand, not endorsing it. When they say we want, that is the operative framing here. This is what people expect from law, and the author is setting up that expectation so it can be dismantled later. Every descriptor in this paragraph, rational, coherent, consistently applied, blind, it all points in one direction. And you don't need to memorize them individually. You just grab the concept and keep pace, moderate your speed. The purpose of this paragraph is the setup, not the argument. Then paragraph 2 is the mirror image. Same opening structure, but the opposite demand. Now we want law that is connected to social reality, sensitive to context, and capable of producing results that people can recognize as fair. And I'm talking about substantive fairness here. That distinction between procedural and substantive justice is the fulcrum of the entire passage. When they say as opposed to substantive, they are doing heavy structural work here. The author is drawing a hard line between a system that follows the rules correctly and a system that actually delivers justice. And every move in paragraph 3 depends on that distinction landing. Now, here's what you need to notice about this paragraph. It is noticeably longer and more detailed than the first paragraph. The author is spending time offering qualifications. Sure, someone has to lose, but the outcome does not have to be the one you personally wanted, but then they circle back with force to the idea that outcomes must be substantively just. The phrase extreme formalism shows up near the end, and that is not neutral language. The author is not just describing the second demand, the author is loading the dice. The way this paragraph is built, the space given to it, the emotional weight of phrases like speaks little to the substance of justice, the insistence on subjective experience, that tells you where the author's sympathies lie before paragraph 3 even begins. So you want to read this more carefully than paragraph 1. Then you want to slow down through the middle section where the qualifications pile up because the test will use those qualifications to build wrong answers that overstate the author's position. Then paragraph 3 is the center of gravity. That's where the author stops presenting and starts concluding. It seems then is a conclusion marker. The author is drawing an inference from everything above. And the conclusion here is not soft. The tension is called irreconcilable. Then the author lays out a clean logical chain. Formalism cannot produce substantive justice without social equality. We do not have that equality, therefore formalism should be abandoned. Now I want you to pay attention to the conditional logic here because the test loves it. The author is not saying formalism is inherently bad. The author is saying formalism fails under specific conditions, conditions of social inequality. When they say without this equality, formalism may very well perpetuate injustice, that's giving you the mechanism. And then bound to fail and misguided project, at the end tell you the author is not leaving any door open. That is a strong, committed position. So slow down on every sentence in this paragraph. Each one carries weight for the questions later. Now, the passage's structural archetype here is close to old view versus new view, but it's not a clean fit. It's really competing demands leading to a verdict. Paragraphs 1 and 2 present 2 values that both sound reasonable in isolation, And then paragraph 3 breaks the tie by arguing that one must yield to the other under real-world conditions. And so the deviation here from a standard old view, new view setup is that neither demand is framed as outdated or wrong in the abstract. The author's argument here is conditional, that formalism fails because of circumstances, not because of some flaw in its internal logic. And so here's a speed map for this one. Paragraph 1 at a pretty steady pace, get the concept, don't linger on individual description words. Paragraph 2, you slow down a bit, especially through the qualifications in the middle and the extreme formalism language near the end. Paragraph 3, you want to slow down, every sentence there matters. Now, the key move in this passage is the asymmetry between paragraphs 1 and 2, disguised as symmetry. The passage opens with what looks like a perfectly balanced two-sided setup. On one hand, followed by on the other hand. This is textbook neutral framing. But the author has a thumb on the scale from the start. Paragraph 2 gets more space, more qualifications, more emotional language, and more specificity. By the time you reach paragraph 3, the author is not resolving a genuine open question. The author is cashing out an argument that was being constructed through the way each demand was presented. This is a ramp. And so what is the author's stance here? They reject formalism as a viable legal principle, qualified by the condition that social inequality persists. Now, most students read the structure of on the one hand, on the other hand, and they walk into the questions thinking this is a balanced exploration of an unresolved tension, but it's not. The author concedes that formalism sounds appealing in the abstract, but they conclude it fails in practice and should be abandoned. That is a mistaken author stance error, confusing a view the author holds with one they describe fairly from someone else. And it's going to cost you on any question asking what the author would most likely agree with or what best describes the author's attitude toward formalism. So you want to expect at least one wrong answer that frames the author as neutral or undecided. It's going to be tempting because paragraphs 1 and 2 feel even-handed. But the passage ends with misguided project. And that is not the language of somebody still weighing options. So let's talk about question predictions. You're going to want to expect a main point question where the trap answer describes the passage as an examination of the tension between two values without capturing the author's verdict. You can expect an author's attitude question where the trap frames the author as balanced or ambivalent. And you want to expect at least one question testing whether you understood the conditional structure of the argument, something asking whether the author believes formalism could ever work, with the right answer hinging on the social equality condition. Now, before you touch the questions, you want to make sure you can answer these three things. Does the author believe the tension between formalism and substantive justice can be resolved under current conditions? What specific condition does the author say would need to change for formalism to work? And does the author think that change is realistic? And when paragraph 1 presents formalism sympathetically, is that the author's own position or is it a demand being reported? So that's passage 1. Now let's talk passage 2. This is Prep Test 156, Section 3, Passage 2. This is a comparative set. The topic here is whether paranormal phenomena might exist beyond the reach of scientific investigation. The difficulty level here is medium because the tonal contrast between the two passages tricks students into misreading what each author is actually committed to. Passage B is so aggressive that it makes passage A sound more extreme than it is, and that distortion is where the test writers are going to build their traps. The skimming trap is in passage A, specifically the complementarity analogy near the end. Students either glaze over it because it sounds like physics jargon, or they overweight it and treat it as the main argument. And both moves here cause problems. And that analogy is doing the real structural work. It's Dyson's attempt to give philosophical cover to a position he knows sounds unscientific. And if you don't understand why he reaches for it, you're going to mischaracterize his position on at least one question. Both of the passages are argumentative, but they argue differently. Passage A builds a case for keeping a door open, and passage B slams it shut. The dominant relationship is direct disagreement, not about whether paranormal phenomena are proven, but about whether it's even reasonable to entertain the possibility given the current evidence, and that's the fight. They're not talking past each other. Passage B engages Dyson's specific arguments, but they're working from incompatible assumptions about what constitutes acceptable evidence. And that foundational mismatch is what drives every surface level disagreement. Let's talk about passage A. Dyson opens by mapping a spectrum. It's reductionist on one end and traditional on the other. Reductionists think all knowledge reduces to science. Traditionalists think science is one valid source of knowledge among several. And the opening paragraph looks like background, but it's not. Dyson is positioning himself before he makes his actual argument. He places himself near the traditional extreme, which means he's building in permission to take non-scientific evidence seriously. And that self-placement is the foundation for everything that follows. If you skip it or you treat it as just scene setting, you're going to miss why he thinks his later argument holds together. And then he connects the spectrum to his real subject. The phrase closely connected is a deliberate link. He's saying your position on whether science explains everything determines what you do with the paranormal question. Skeptics, who sit near the reductionist end, look at the failure of scientific experiments and conclude paranormal phenomena don't exist. Dyson doesn't believe that conclusion, and he tells you exactly why. Because he's not a reductionist. He is being transparent about the fact that his philosophical commitments are shaping his interpretation of the evidence. And that's actually unusual because most authors bury that move, and Dyson puts it right on the surface. Now, here is where students misread him. Dyson is not arguing that paranormal events are real. He's arguing that their existence is a tenable hypothesis. And that's his words, not mine. The phrase tenable and plausible is doing careful, deliberate work. He's not staking a claim, he is holding a door open. And if you walk away from passage A thinking Dyson believes psychic powers definitely exist, you've overshot his actual stance, and the test is going to punish you for it. His evidence is anecdotal here, and he knows it. He doesn't pretend otherwise. He even names the limitation directly. This evidence cannot be reproduced under controlled conditions. But then he argues that his anecdotal evidence has been collected responsibly. The organizations interviewed eyewitnesses promptly. They documented stories carefully. So he's not saying anecdotes are as good as lab results. He's just saying they shouldn't be discarded entirely just because they don't meet the standard of reproducibility. And so there is a difference between saying this evidence proves paranormal phenomena and this evidence is worth taking seriously. Dyson is making the second argument here, not the first. And then comes the move that holds passage A together. Dyson argues that paranormal phenomena only seem to occur under stress and strong emotion, which are conditions that are fundamentally incompatible with controlled experiments. And so the failure of the lab tests doesn't actually disprove anything. It just means the testing method cannot access the phenomenon. So you want to slow down here. That is his core structural move. He is reframing the absence of scientific evidence. What looks like a disproof becomes, in his framing, a limitation of method. The evidence isn't negative, it is just inapplicable. And that reframe is the engine of his entire argument. Then the complementarity analogy at the end is his attempt to give that reframe scientific respectability. In quantum physics, complementarity means two descriptions of nature can both be valid, but cannot be observed at the same time. Light behaves as a wave in one experiment and as particles in another, but never both simultaneously. And Dyson is drawing a parallel. Paranormal phenomena and scientific observation might relate the same way. Both of them are real, but they are mutually exclusive in how they manifest. You've got to understand what he is comparing, not the physics itself. The quantum details are illustration. The structural function is legitimization. He's borrowing authority from physics to prop up a claim that would otherwise sound purely speculative. Now, let's talk about passage B. The author of passage B is having none of this. They have the word ridiculous appearing in the very first sentence, and so that's not a slow build, right? The dismissal is immediate and it's total, and the tone never softens throughout the passage. This passage exists to dismantle Dyson's reasoning point by point, and they're not pretending to be balanced about it. Their attack here has three distinct targets. The first is anecdotal evidence. Passage B's author says flatly that anecdotes cannot establish whether a phenomenon is real. The phrase, anecdotes do not make a science, is the bluntest version of that claim. Only controlled experiments can answer this question. Second, those controlled experiments have already been run repeatedly, and the results are, in this author's word, unequivocal. Psychic power does not survive testing. Third, the complementarity analogy is inapplicable. The author here draws a hard binary. Either people can read minds or they cannot. There is no wave-particle situation here. The analogy doesn't transfer because the paranormal question has a yes-no answer, and science has already supplied it. Now, notice here that passage B never engages with Dyson's point about stress and emotion making phenomena inaccessible to lab conditions. It just reasserts that the experiments have been done and the results are clear. That's a gap in the rebuttal, and the test might ask about it. Now, you want to move through passage B at a faster pace than passage A because it's structurally simple. Setup, attack, 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 conclusion. There are no hidden qualifications, no concessions, no moments where the author softens the position. Every sentence reinforces the same stance. Now, let's talk about the relationship in full. These passages disagree on nearly everything, but the disagreements stack in a specific order. At the base level, they disagree about epistemology. What kinds of evidence count? Dyson thinks carefully collected anecdotal evidence has value. Passage B thinks only controlled experiments matter. One layer up, they disagree about what the experimental failures mean. Dyson says the method can't reach the phenomenon. Passage B says the method has already settled the question. At the top, they disagree about whether the complementarity concept applies. Dyson thinks it offers a valid framework for understanding why scientific methods and paranormal phenomena can't coexist in the same observation. Passage B thinks the analogy is a stretch that doesn't fit. Now, here's one place they do connect. Both acknowledge that controlled scientific experiments have failed to confirm paranormal phenomena. They agree on the data, but they disagree completely on what the data means. And that shared factual ground, combined with opposite interpretations, is classic comparative passage territory. You want to expect at least one question built around it. Now, here's the key move. Dyson reframes the failure of scientific experiments as a limitation of the method rather than a disproof of the phenomenon. And passage B rejects that reframe entirely. Every question about the relationship between these passages will orbit around that structural tension. Now, here is passage A's stance. It cautiously supports the plausibility of paranormal phenomena, qualified by an explicit acknowledgement that the evidence is anecdotal and the hypothesis remains unproven. Passage B's stance is that they reject Dyson's position entirely with no qualification and no concession. Now, the main trap for this set is that most students end up thinking Dyson is arguing that paranormal phenomena are real, but actually, he's arguing that dismissing them is premature given the limits of scientific methodology. And that is a mistaken author stance error, treating a qualified openness as an affirmative claim. It's going to burn you hardest on any question asking what Dyson would most likely agree with, because the trap answers will attribute stronger beliefs to him than he actually expresses. And the correct answer is going to be one that sounds tentative. Students tend to reject it because it feels too weak after reading passage B's forceful rebuttal. Now, before you touch the questions, we want to make sure you can answer these three things. First, what does Dyson mean when he calls his position a hypothesis rather than a conclusion? And how does that word choice limit the strength of his claim? Second, why does the author of passage B think complementarity analogy fails, and what assumption about the paranormal question drives that rejection? Third, where exactly do both authors agree on the facts but diverge on what those facts prove. Now I see a question from Phaedra commenting, it's really hard to follow when you don't show the passages. I really wish I could, but due to copyright constraints, it's LSAC's intellectual property. We don't want to get shut down or sued, so I can't display the questions on screen. You can access them directly from your lsac.org Law Hub account. That's the best place to access the questions and follow along. And if you can't follow along now, of course, these lives are all recorded on the YouTube channel and you can catch up with them later. And Tommy, I'm glad you're enjoying the lives. Our next one. This is Prep Test 156, Section 3, Passage 3. This is a humanities passage about the origins of bebop and whether it was really an anti-commercial revolution. The difficulty level here is medium, not because the content is hard necessarily, but because the passage spends so long inside of you, the author ultimately rejects that students lose track of whose voice they're even hearing anymore. And that's the trap baked into the structure of the passage itself. And if you don't catch it during the read, the questions are going to eat you alive. Now, this passage punishes skimming in paragraph 1. It's dense, full of quotations, and it sounds authoritative. And if you read it at a cruising speed, you're going to walk away thinking the author believed swing was the dead end and commercialism was the problem. And that is exactly backward. The passage also punishes you if you miss the transition to paragraph 3 because the author's own position doesn't appear until more than halfway through and it arrives without a lot of fanfare. Now, this is a humanities passage, and what it's doing is dismantling a popular historical narrative. The main point here is the standard story that bebop was a rebellion against commercialism gets the relationship between bebop musicians and the market wrong. They weren't escaping commerce, they were renegotiating their place inside it. So this passage is not about what caused bebop, it's about what's wrong with the standard story of what caused bebop. And so if you walk into this passage thinking they explained the origins of a musical movement, you've already lost the thread here. Now, paragraph 1 is doing something sneaky, and it's long enough that the trick has time to work on you. It opens with "in typical accounts," and that phrase is doing enormous structural work. It tells you that everything that follows is a position being reported, not endorsed. But the paragraph runs so long and builds so much momentum that by the time you're reading about swing as a billion-dollar rut and bebop as the explosive force that broke the logjam, it feels like you're reading the author's own argument, but you're not. You are reading the author's reconstruction of what other people have argued. And the author is being meticulous about it precisely because they're about to tear it apart. Now, you want to pay attention to the quoted phrases scattered throughout the paragraph. Threadbare, harmonic and melodic blind alley, death by entropy, billion-dollar rut. Those are not the author's descriptions. They are sampled from various writings on jazz, as the passage says. The author is collecting these metaphors like evidence in a case file. And then there's the parallel to crisis theory in classical music. The author points out that classical music historians tell a structurally identical story about tonality wearing out and modernity erupting. And that parallel isn't there to validate the bebop narrative. It's there to suggest the narrative is borrowed, that jazz historians grabbed a template from another genre's mythology and pasted it over bebop's actual history. And that is a subtle move, but it is a devastating one. If you miss it, you're going to misread it as the author agreeing that jazz faced the same kind of crisis. Now, the last few sentences of paragraph 1 spell out the commercial version of the story. Even after swing had run its course, the music industry kept it on life support, trapping musicians in a dead idiom. And bebop blew the whole thing up. So this framing, art versus commerce, authentic expression versus industry machinery, that is the core claim the author will reject. But you've got to register it clearly here so you recognize it when it gets dismantled later. You want to read this paragraph at a medium speed with your guard up. Track the claims, but hold them at arm's length. Your job is to know what the standard story says without buying into it. And then paragraph 2 extends that standard narrative one step further, and it's the paragraph most students should move through quickly. It draws out an implication that the historians themselves don't state directly that jazz history has a built-in direction, what the passage calls a teleology. The arc goes early jazz to swing to bebop, with jazz gradually shedding its connections to dance, entertainment, and popular song until bebop completes the journey and becomes capital A art. Now, the word implicit matters here. The author is saying these historians don't announce this teleology outright, but it's embedded in how they frame the story. And that is a sharper observation than it first appears to be. The author is reading these accounts more carefully than the people who wrote them. The function of this paragraph is completion. It takes the narrative from paragraph 1, which focused on the commercialism as villain angle, and reveals deeper assumptions underneath, that jazz was always moving towards autonomy and bebop was the destination. And once you see that, you understand the full shape of what the author is about to reject. But you don't want to linger here because the paragraph here is filling out the target and the shot is what comes next. So paragraph 3 is the real center of gravity. This is where the author finally speaks in their own voice, and the turn here is sharp. They say, this insistence that bebop is anti-commercial may suit the needs of contemporary jazz discourse, but it is a poor basis for historical inquiry. And that sentence is the hinge of the whole thing. Everything before it was someone else's argument, and everything after it is the author's argument. That is the main point. Now, the author's critique here has 2 layers. The first is methodological. The standard account idealizes the circumstances of artistic creation and represses the unpleasant reality that commercial relationships run through all of music, not just swing. In other words, you can't treat commerce as something that corrupts art from outside because it's already inside the room. The second layer is historical. For Parker, Gillespie, and Monk, the commercial music world wasn't a prison they needed to escape. It was the system of interactions that defined music as a profession and made their work possible in the first place. So that phrase, making their achievements possible, directly reverses the standard story. Commerce didn't hold bebop back. Commerce was the ground bebop grew out of. Now, the passage closes with a careful qualification. The author acknowledges that these musicians did create something genuinely new. They willed a new musical subculture into being, but the goal wasn't disengagement from the commercial world. It was a new point of engagement with it, one that would give them more autonomy and recognition while still operating inside the professional music economy. And that distinction between disengagement and re-engagement is precise, and the test will absolutely check whether you caught it. So you want to slow down throughout this entire paragraph. This is where the questions are going to come from, and that's where your note-taking should be the most. So the key move here, the passage builds an elaborate, persuasive-sounding narrative across 2 full paragraphs, then reveals in paragraph 3 that the narrative is the thing being critiqued. The structural tension is between how convincing the standard account sounds and how decisively the author dismisses it. The test writers here are going to exploit the sheer length and details of paragraphs 1 and 2 to trick you into choices that treat the described view as the author's view. Now, the structural archetype here is the described view versus the author's critique. What they deviate from here is that the described view gets 2 full paragraphs, which is way more real estate than usual. And that's how they make the trap effective. Most passages that involve the old view versus new view distinction, they kind of show their cards early. This one gives enough space to the old view, long enough, that it starts to feel like the passage's thesis. Now let's talk about the author's opinion. They are rejecting the anti-commercial interpretation of bebop, qualified by acknowledgement that the musicians did create something genuinely new, but within the commercial system, not against it. Now here's the main trap. Most students think the author views commercialism as the force that held jazz back, but actually, the author thinks commercialism was the enabling condition for bebop, not the obstacle. This is a mistaken author's stance error, confusing the view being described with the view being held, and it will wreck any question about the author's attitude, the purpose of the passage, or the function of paragraph 1. If you pick an answer that says the author believes swing was artistically exhausted, or that bebop represented a decisive break from commercial music, you have fallen for the exact trick the passage wanted you to fall for. Now let's talk about question type predictions. You can expect a main point question with a trap answer that describes the standard narrative as though the author endorses it. Second, you can expect a function question about paragraph 1. The right answer will say something like, presents a view the author goes on to challenge. And the trap will say, it establishes the author's argument. You can also expect an author's attitude question where the wrong answers frame the author as being hostile to commercialism or nostalgic for bebop's purity. In terms of speed, you want to go at paragraph 1 medium speed with your guard up, go through paragraph 2 fast, and slow down for paragraph 3, which is of course the meat of the passage. Now, before you get to the questions, 3 things you want to answer. First, whose views are being presented in paragraph 1? The author's or other historians? Second, what does the author think the bebop musicians' actual relationship to commercialism was? Were they fleeing it, or were they repositioning within it? And third, what is the author's problem with the crisis theory parallel? Is it that classical music didn't really face a crisis, or that borrowing that template distorts what actually happened with bebop? So that's passage 3. If you found these helpful, I do these lives every single weekday, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific, here on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, wherever you're watching this. If you find these helpful, please spread the word. The only way this grows is through word of mouth. I don't do any advertising for these lives, and the algorithm doesn't really boost them. So do share this to your socials, your LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, wherever you're watching this. If you want to book a free tutoring lesson with me, the link's below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well. I'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care. Thanks for joining.